Well, hello and welcome back to another D3 DataViz series. In this series of 4 videos, I would like to walk through the entire process of building a D3 project from design all the way up to completion. We're just going to build a little scatter plot. I'll show you in just a second here what my data is going to look like. But the 4 videos are going to be broken up like this. In this video, number 1, we're just going to talk about the design of the project. We're going to talk a little bit about the data set. And then we'll talk about loading that data. If you've just come from the D3 data loading series, the concepts that you saw there are all correct, but the new version of D3 version 5 uses a slightly new technique for loading data, and we're going to talk about that. It's called promises. The second video that we'll do will be all about scales. Scales are a very underutilized part of D3, but they make our lives significantly easier. We will use scales in both videos 3 and videos 4, so building them early makes a lot of sense. Video 3 is going to talk about how we put the axes, x and y axes, onto our scatter plot, and how we use scales to do that, and how we arrange them, and how we organize the way that our SVG viewport looks. And then finally, in video 4, we're going to get around to drawing some circles on our scatter plot. And we'll also work with some callback functions to create some more interactivity for the site itself. The data set that I'd like to work with is this one. This is a visualization that I've already made in R using ggplot. And if you've worked with me in a digital course, or if you've taken any of the DataViz workshops in the Digital Scholarship Center at the University of Alberta, you'll have seen this because it's one of my favorite go-to data sets. This was published in 2013 by a series of British researchers who were looking at family units, and they went to parish churches in East London and transcribed the records there. As you know, you go through the church 3 times. You go when you get christened or baptized, when you get married, and then again when you die. So I downloaded their data set and I extracted a subset of the records. I only looked for people who themselves as children were christened in that church, but who were also then listed as a parent when their child was christened. And by taking the dates of those 2 events, I could calculate with a lot of precision exactly how old they were when they became parents. And this is the result. So you can see here I've got some teal green circles for men and some kind of reddish orange circles for women. You can see down at the bottom there's an x-axis, that's the year, and then the y-axis here is the age. And you can see that as time goes by, people get older and older, and also we have more and more data points. So I would like to build an interactive version of this, and I would like to put some maybe checkboxes on the web page so that we can look at men and women either independently from each other or together. And there's so many dots here. I just don't think that I can really make D3 look nice with that much data in there. So I'm going to slice this into 3 parts. The first data set is just going to be from, say, about 1550 here up to 1599. There are not very many data points there, although there are still about 118 points in that slice there. The second one will be a little bit of a shorter time frame. This is about 1600 to say 1624. Obviously, you can see more data there. There are about 227 points there, and you can see that the parents are older, right? Especially the men. The third data set is this is pretty dense here. This is 1625 to only about 1640, so only about 15 years or so, and there's still 330 some odd data points here. But you can see then on the x-axis, each one of these slices is a slightly different length of time, and on the y-axis, as we proceed through history, the parents get older and older and older. So in D3, I'm going to want my axes to transition and to scale properly so that we can see that. That fourth bit over there, that data set, I'm not going to handle that. We'll leave that for the future. Somebody else can work on that part of it. Right. Well, the design, I think this is my rough wireframe about how I would like this to look. Obviously, one of the most important parts about this is the SVG viewport itself. I don't really know how big I want to make that, but I'll do something that kind of shows up nice on my laptop, and if I need to scale it later, then we can work on that. Obviously, this is where my axes are going to go. So just like in the last data viz, I'm going to have an x-axis down here at the bottom for years, and I'll have a y-axis going vertically for ages. And I think what I'll do is put at the top, this is where I would like my interactivity to happen. So I'm going to put some buttons in here or some menus or things like that, my checkboxes. Obviously, one of the things that I know that I want is to be able to look at men and women either separately or together. So, for example, if somebody puts a checkbox in the box men, then all the men show up on the dots. If they also check women, then the women show up. And if they uncheck one of those boxes, those dots will disappear, etc., etc. And so we'll work on some callback functions later and get D3 to do those transitions properly. Because I've got those three different data sets, I think I'm going to build those as three separate CSV files. However, in my interactivity, I just would like users to be able to choose the dates that they would like to look at. So I would like to build a little bit of a drop-down menu here or something so that they can just select one of those three data sets. They don't need to know that these are phase 1 or phase 2. They don't need to know that. They don't even need to know that there are CSV files back there somewhere. All they need to know is which dates they want to look at. And so as they choose something out of that menu, a new date, I want to load the data set dynamically, and then we'll have all of the D3 adjust properly. And when it does that, obviously, we will have to change that scale of the x-axis. So the x-axis will still take up the same amount of space in the SVG container, but those tick marks will be in different places. So at first, we're at about 50 years or so, but that third data set is only 15 years. So that x-axis is going to have to shift and scale a little bit. But the same for the y-axis. We noticed in that last data visualization that as time goes by, parents get older. So the x-axis will still take up the same amount of space in the SVG window, but those tick marks will be different to reflect the ages. Let's take a look at what I've started to build here already. Just like in the data loading video series, I'm just going to work on my desktop here. So I've created a new folder just called Scatterplot, and I have already taken the liberty to start up my little Python web server. So if that doesn't make any sense, go back and look at the data loading series video 2. Quick tour here. I have created a few subfolders for some of my work. So I have a CSS folder. There is a styles CSS that I've started to create in there. I'll keep modifying that as I go along. I have a folder for data, and you will notice that I've already cleaned up my data set, and I have 3 CSV files there. And so these are what we'll be loading dynamically from D3. I have a JS folder with my library in it. This is where I'm going to write all of my custom code, where I'm going to write all of my D3 stuff. And my HTML, I only have one HTML page. And I'm just going to call it index.html. We know, working on the Hugo dev server and many other places, that the default file name is index.html. And so I'm just going to work with that. If we look at some of the code, it looks like this. So here's my HTML document. There's not very much here. We will look at this in a little bit more detail. But you'll notice that there are several divs up here at the top. I'll show you those in just a second. And down here at line 33, there is just a very, very lonely little SVG container that has nothing in it. And that's where all the action is going to happen. But I'm going to be adding parts to the DOM tree there. I'm going to be adding and hanging stuff in that SVG container with D3. You'll notice up at the top at line 7, I have already included the D3 library itself with a script tag, and my library is called down at the bottom, down here at line 36. And again, I put my stuff down at the bottom because my code is going to assume that the DOM tree has been constructed already. So if I put my script up in the head section, it will not yet have been constructed. As we talked about before, there are some tricks that I can do to prevent the execution of my library, but I'm not going to worry about that. I'm just going to dump it down here at the bottom, and it's going to be fine. I do have a few CSS styles that I've already started to create, so I'm not going to talk my way through this very much. You'll see that there's a body header and some stuff. Here's my SVG container. I decided I'm going to make it about 600 pixels by 600 pixels. And then I've got a few divs down here as well. And so I have one at the top for buttons, and you see I have one for the checkboxes, and then I have another one for the data set. My JavaScript library, I've already started to put a few things in here, and I'm going to return to that here in just a minute when we start to work on it. But one of the questions that we have is, how do you organize something like this? How do we organize a big library? Some people like to put functions in here in the order in which they get called. Some people actually even like to alphabetize their functions. But me, I prefer putting things into units or groups. So this will probably change as we go along, but so far you can see I have some stuff up here for global variables. I have a little section here for some event handlers. We'll talk about that in a moment. I have a load file function here, and even a helper function for get a file name. So data loading, drawing SVG, helping. As we go through in the next couple of videos, I'm going to add some things for scales, and I'm going to add some things for axes, and so I already have a kind of a placeholder for those. Well, here's my little hack-up version of that site. Of that HTML. You see that I've got a title up here at the top, and then there's a div right under my title. This is where my interactivity is going to happen. Here's my checkboxes for men and women, so we can select both of those or neither of those. And I added in HTML select menu here so that my user can choose the dataset or the years that they want to do. I call it dataset, but I might say choose the years you'd like. I don't know what else. I'll fix that later. So what I would like it to do is, as we choose a dataset out of that menu, D3 will load dynamically. Obviously, you'll see down here at the bottom, this is where my SVG container is. That's where all of that data visualization is going to start to happen. I've just arranged my window here so that my console log is on the right-hand side. I just need a little extra real estate so that I can see what's happening in that SVG window. Let's just take a quick peek here at my CSV file, and then we'll review the new version 5 way of loading data. All of my CSV files, all three of them, have exactly this structure, which is that there are 3 columns. So the first column is a year, the second column is an age, and then the third column is a gender. And notice that obviously year and age are both numbers. And we know, if you watched the data loading videos, those are going to get imported by D3 as strings. So one of the things that I would like to do is to convert those 2 columns back to numbers. Obviously, gender over here is just, it's an F and it's an M. So those I will leave as strings. Version 5 of D3 doesn't load data actually the way that it used to. So if you've just watched those data loading videos, that's exactly how D3 loaded in version 3 and version 4. Version 5 now is a little bit different. But I want to emphasize the concepts that we're talking about in those data loading videos are not actually wrong. It's still asynchronous. We still have to accommodate the weird asynchronous nature of the way that D3 loads data. Technically speaking now, though, under the hood, it doesn't actually use that XML HTTP request object anymore. It doesn't really use AJAX the way I described in those videos. However, even though it uses a new thing called fetch or fetch API, it's still asynchronous, and we still have to compensate for that. What happens now in the new version is that a function like d3.csv now creates what's called a promise. That is to say, it is an obligation that we will one day eventually have loaded that CSV file. And if that CSV file loads properly, then our promise has been fulfilled. But if the CSV file doesn't load properly, then that promise is rejected. And so here's a little template of the code that we're going to be using, because I'd like to modernize our data loading here in this particular project. So we've got a couple of things. The first line here obviously is the D3 CSV, we're loading a file. I'm going to talk about that here in just a second. But you can think about this as a kind of extended if-then-else scenario. So while d3.csv happens to be loading that file, the promise status is pending. Nothing will happen. If the CSV file loads properly, then the status of the promise is fulfilled. And when the status of the promise is fulfilled, this then block will be executed, and we'll put a little callback function in here. If something goes wrong, like we didn't point to the right file, or it's pointing to the wrong directory or something like that, then the promise will be rejected because something went wrong and we just never completed as we should have. In that case, the catch block will be executed. So we could do something else there. We could log something to the console window, we could add something to the web page, whatever we want to do in that particular case. So if you think about it, this is like a little if then else block. Or if you've ever worked with exceptions in another language, this is sort of like a try catch block, or in Python a try except block. So if you've worked with exceptions, this structure should be familiar to you from those other languages. Well, obviously what we need to do is we need to send it a couple of things, just like we always did before. We have to send d3.csv a file to load. And we know already in this project there are 3 of those CSV files. It's going to be one of those. In the data loading videos, we also sent it a callback function, and that callback function was to process that data in some way. And I noticed that, and we noticed in that video series, that callback function got called once per row. Every single row that got loaded in the CSV file was handed off to that callback function. Well, in version 5, they don't even call it a callback function anymore. They call it a row conversion function. And we saw in the data loading videos exactly how this works. And because we know that the columns of year and age need to be converted from strings into numbers, this is where we will do that. If you go on the line and you look at the API documentation for D3, it just says here, an optional row conversion function may be specified to map and filter row objects to a more specific representation. Well, that maybe is a little bit of verbiage, but for us it means convert those strings back into numbers, please. Right, so that's what we're going to use that for. So in our case, it's going to look probably something like this, right? We'll call d3.csv, and I'm going to load some file like data/parents1550. That's a CSV file. And then we'll write a callback function or a row conversion function. I'll just call it clean rows. And what that's going to do is to convert those string representations back into numbers. Once the promise has been fulfilled, we will execute the then block, and so we'll have a function in here, and it will be a growing anonymous function, and we'll pass it some data like D. We could call it data, we could call it dataset. That's just going to be a local variable for that anonymous function. We will also provide a catch block here, and in our case the catch block isn't really going to do very much. It's just going to say maybe log an error to the console or something like that, and something really minimal. We're going to test drive this so often that probably that catch block will not really ever be executed, but it's great to have it there in the event that something weird goes wrong. Well, I've been doing some coding in the library, but let's take a look at the website and see how the data load is working, and then I'll show you the code behind the scenes. So obviously the way that I'd like this to work is as my users select a new value out of this HTML select menu, I would like D3 to be able to load that data set dynamically. And in fact, that's what happens. So you can see this looks like a little bit of a mess over here in the console log, but you can see I'm loading data/parents1550 CSV, and I've got a bunch of stuff here. Now, this doesn't look like it used to look, but that's okay. You can see down here too, we've got the 3 columns, and even if I go in now and look at a global data set and just pull one of them out, you can see It's year 1571, age 29. Those are both numbers, gender, F, string. Perfect. If I choose something else out of my HTML select menu, I get a new data set. And so the fourth element there, year 1601, 33.9, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's all great. Does it work for the third? It does. That's fantastic. Now, one of the things you'll notice is that in the console log, this data doesn't look like it used to look, but that's okay. We can still use it in exactly the same way. So don't panic about that structure and what that looks like. So let's just take a quick tour through the code here as we're kind of moving towards the end of this particular video. And again, up here at the top, I'm going to create a couple of global variables here. I've added one for the data directory. Everything is going to be in that data folder. So I'm just going to prepend that to the name of the function or the file that I get. I've created a new variable here called global dataset, and I'm going to push everything into that global dataset. What I do, one of the first things that I do is I have to add an event handler to that select menu. So I'm choosing the DOM element called file name, and I am adding an event handler for a change event. And anytime that DOM element changes value, I'm calling load file, which is down here on line now 28. So if I go back and look at my HTML, that select menu is right here. Well, actually, right here. The ID is file name, and you'll notice that the way this select menu works is there's option value equals something, and well, that's actually the only one I have in there. So the way the select menu works is that the top value, number 20, line 25 there, the value is a zero length string, and that one is selected. So every time the window loads, that will be the option that everybody gets to see. When they select something else, like it's say line 26, the value of that item is parent underscore 1550. What does that mean? Well, when I come back to my library and I load file, let's skip down, I'm going to get the file name that I need, and I'm calling here at line 29 a little function, a little helper function that's going to help me get that file name. What I do in that helper function is I use D3 to select the DOM element that has an ID of file name, and I get one property out of it, which is the value property. Now, at the top, if they haven't selected a file name, that's going to be a zero length string. So I'm actually just checking for that. If the value is not a zero length string, I'm going to concatenate together a proper file name and then return it. Otherwise, I'm just going to return a value null. And the value null says, just don't do anything right now. Load file is where we do our D3 load. So if file name happens to be null, I just return, I bounce out, and I don't do anything. But here is the C3 DSV, sorry, the D3 CSV that we were working on. So I am trying to load file name, the string that's in the variable called file name. And while that's pending, nothing will happen. But as it loads, it will pass every row to a new function called clean rows. That will clean it and return it. If we just scroll down a little bit to look at clean rows, you can see down here at line 54, I am returning a little JSON object that has 3 key value pairs. The first one is year, and the plus in front of d.year says, please turn that back into a number. The second key value pair is age. That's also being turned into a number. The third key value pair is gender, but I am just leaving that alone because it's a string. So clean rows is processing every single row in that CSV file. When the promise has been fulfilled on line 32, the then block at line 33 will get executed. There is a tiny callback function, an anonymous function right here, that takes that data set as it has been loaded. Data set is a local variable. And at line 34, I'm just copying it into my global data set. And I'm also logging the data set to the console. Now, as we progress over the next 3 videos, this will get a lot bigger. So there's going to be a ton of stuff in there. I have a catch block down at the end, and all I'm doing right now is just console logging. I couldn't load that. And that's all that I'm doing at that particular moment. All right. So hopefully that makes a bit of sense. I still don't have any scales or any axes here, but I have attached an event handler, and that event handler loads a file dynamically every time I change the value of that select menu, and we get proper data out of the back. So we're ready to go on to the next step. All right, well, that's the end of design and data loading. Hopefully that work about promises made some sense. You can go out and find some tutorials on that on the web. I gotta tell you, I think they're not wholly clear. So I hope this has really clarified that. The next video in the series is going to be about scales. And so we're going to learn how to appropriately size our data for the SVG window that we have. So stay tuned for that one.